Justice Jackson, we learned, is the answer to a recent Jeopardy question. Name the only person in the history of the United States to be Solicitor General, Attorney General, and a Justice of the Supreme Court.
That's really wonderful. I didn't know about the center, but I'm glad to hear about it. It's wonderful.
The most important question everybody wants to know, on campus, what was it like to be on Stephen Colbert?
You know, I had never seen Stephen Colbert's show before. I was invited to go on, and I said to my staff, oh, there's this guy, Colbert, wants me to come on his show. I don't know anything about it. And their eyes got big. Oh, you have to do it. And I said, well, what's the show like? He said, oh, he's really difficult. He'll be he'll be snarky, and he'll make fun of you, and he'll be very kind of rude and difficult. I said, well, why would I want to go on a show like that? And my students were unbelievably excited about that. I did watch a few episodes before I went on. It was a very different kind of interview, but it was great. It was a lot of fun. He came out of character, so I got to meet him and talk to him a little bit before we went on set. It was a challenging interview because typically they have something that's focused on a pretty precise issue. And my stuff was pretty broad, and so it was hard to prepare, so you just have to go with the flow. But I had fun.
What was his focus?
He talked about mass incarceration, he talked about race, he talked about the death penalty, he talked about juveniles, he talked about virtually the whole gambit of a range of civil rights issues. I think, you know, his questions were pretty much tied to jokes that he wanted to tell. But I thought it was, you know, interesting to talk to people about those issues in a setting like that. He has an audience that, to a certain extent, gets their news from these kinds of programs. And so we got a lot of feedback about the issues that we raised, and I thought that was positive.
Did you meet ahead of time in the green room? Was there a...
We had a brief green room meeting, but it didn't give me any guidance about what was substantively going to be on the docket.
So you were thrown into the lion's den?
Thrown into the lion's den, and just had to kind of go with it.
You know, I interviewed a guy named His Royal Highness Prince Zayed. He was the Jordanian ambassador for the United Nations, but he was put on Colbert.
Is that right?
And he said that it was a great experience, et cetera, but they film it such that they then can go do some research on Jordan and look at some funny stuff that kind of with it. Did they do that with you?
You know, I don't know. They seemed to have a good bit of research before I was there because they were asking some pretty particular questions. But I think the topics that I deal with are a little more familiar. They're more in the press, and so he's dealt with some questions of mass incarceration before. He certainly dealt with questions of race before. Even the death penalty has been a topic before. So I think they probably were a little better positioned to kind of know what they wanted to ask about with me. As
you have gotten into this field of you know, the Equal Justice Initiative, did you spend a lot of time studying the civil rights history in here?
Very much so. You know, in interesting ways, I mean, my relationship to this work evolved over time. I grew up in a community where black children couldn't go to the public schools. We grew up with segregation, even though...
Where was that?
This was actually on the eastern shore, on the Delmarva Peninsula, southern Delaware, the eastern shore of Maryland and Virginia. And even though it was in the waning years of the Jim Crow era, it was still very much a part of my early childhood. Beaches were racially segregated, the movie theater was racially segregated, and the schools were racially segregated. And so I had this perspective on civil rights that was really shaped when the lawyers came into our community and opened up the public schools. I had this, my mother was somebody who would always answer any question you asked her. If you said, Mom, what's that star up in the sky? And she wouldn't know the name of the planet, but she'd say, well, that's the brightest star. And she answered every question. She told me there were no bad questions. And the only time I remembered her not asking a question is when we would drive past the Milton Public School. And I'd ask my mom, Mom, what does the word public mean? And she wouldn't tell me, because she'd be taking me to the colored school, which only went to the 8th grade. And so I remembered lawyers coming into our community and opening up, insisting that these schools be opened up to kids like me and the people in my neighborhood. And that created a consciousness about civil rights, and it created a consciousness about struggle. You know, I grew up listening to Dr. King and reading the speeches, and very much had a relationship like that. I didn't really think about what I was going to do, and you know, I went to college, was a philosophy major, didn't really think about what was going to happen after college. You know, I was a senior, and one day somebody came up to me and said, what are you going to do next year? And I thought that was a really unfair question because I hadn't thought about it at all. And it was the first time I realized that nobody's going to pay me to philosophize when I graduate from college. And that's how I ended up in law school. And once there, found my way to the Deep South. Once I started doing this work, yeah, I did become a pretty serious student of the civil rights movement because there were people I was working with who were the icons of that movement. I read Taylor Branch's 3 books, and just got a deeper perspective on the dynamics that went into change. But for my work, actually, we've been very focused not just on civil rights history, but pre-civil rights history. I'm very interested in the legacy of slavery and the way slavery has shaped American discourse on the question of race. I'm interested in the era between Reconstruction and World War II. Because if you don't understand the dynamics in these 2 prior eras, you can't really understand the civil rights movement. And so that's all been part of our work. Our newest project at EJI is actually a project on race and poverty. It's not specific to the criminal justice system. And it's all about changing the narrative that we have in this country about our history of racial inequality and getting people to think more carefully about the way that history has created distortions. You know, Montgomery, Alabama, where I live, if you come to Montgomery, you'll see 59 monuments dedicated to the Confederacy. We talk about 19th century history all the time. You can't go 5 blocks without finding some marker or memorial that's about Civil War or the Confederacy. Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday. Robert Jefferson Davis's birthday is a state holiday. It's not Martin Luther King Day. It's Martin Luther King / Jefferson Davis Day. And there is this romanticism about the Old South, about the Confederacy. But if you'd come to Montgomery before December, you wouldn't find a word about slavery, not one word. And so for us, it becomes necessary to change that narrative. And so we put up markers in downtown Montgomery a few months ago. And, you know, what I'm concerned about is the way in which slavery created myths about people of color. I mean, to sustain it, you actually had to have a narrative in your mind that made it seem okay to own another human being. And that narrative was really constructed around these myths that people of color can't do this, they're not smart, they're not this, they need the whip, they need control, they need all of these things. And there's nothing in the 13th Amendment about these myths. There's nothing in the Emancipation Proclamation about these myths. And so they persist even after slavery ends. And because we haven't talked about that, I still see the legacy of those myths in a lot of contemporary issues. And so for us, it becomes important to talk about slavery. I define the era between Reconstruction and World War II as an era characterized by terrorism. For people of color in this country, their lives were shaped by terror, lynchings, bombings, convict leasing. You couldn't get people to submit to racial segregation and racial subordination if there was no threat behind it. People weren't prepared to just go to the bad, nasty bathroom if there was a nice bathroom. They weren't going to comply with that. They complied because they were being terrorized. And so the civil rights movement is a response to decades of terror and decades and centuries of racial humiliation through enslavement. Decades of frustration where people left the Deep South, the Great Migration, beautifully chronicled in this book that I try to urge everybody to read called The Warmth of Other Suns. Isabel Wilkerson, amazing book. That basically was people they were refugees from terror in the southern United States. And so understanding the civil rights movement really requires us to have a perspective on these historical features that gave rise to these dynamics. And then you can appreciate the kind of courage it took for Rosa Parks to do what she did, for civil rights leaders to do what they did. It was really with a clear understanding that they could lose their lives. And so that becomes really important as you think about the civil rights era. I'm
going to test you.
Okay.
I'm going to give to you that which I gave to Andrew Young,
okay,
Julian Bond.
Okay.
These are baseball cards,
okay,
in essence, of civil rights leaders. And if you have either identify them and have a reaction, the names on the back,
okay,
you can look. But you've won awards named after some of these people.
Yeah.
And so I just, for
sure,
history's sake, Because I think that's a great piece.
Yes. You know, Fred Shuttlesworth, this is Fred Shuttlesworth, he was a minister in Birmingham, Alabama. He was courageous in a way that few people appreciate. Dr. King was actually very reluctant to come to Birmingham in 1963. Dr. King was very ambivalent about the ethics of using children as part of the Children's Crusade. And as you recall, the power of the Birmingham movement was that civil rights leaders said, we're going to get these young kids out of school and let them lead the march. And they couldn't tell their parents. They didn't tell the teachers. In contemporary context, you could see it as a pretty edgy way to make change. But Reverend Shuttlesworth was absolutely persuaded that this is what needed to happen. They called Birmingham Bombingham because of all of the violence, because of all of the bombings. Reverend Shuttlesworth's home was bombed, I think, 4 times. He was threatened with death constantly. And so he is really one of the true icons of the civil rights movement. I just did get an award in his name and met his family. His family members are still extraordinary people. He died not that long ago. An amazing person, incredibly courageous person. I tell these stories sometimes. People say, well, your work must be so hard. You're representing people on death row. You're doing all these difficult cases, challenges. And I think about people like Fred Shuttlesworth. And that's when I realized I can't complain that much, because as hard as my work has been, I've never had to say, my head is bloody but not bowed, which is what he had to say on multiple occasions, because he was attacked and violated in just that way. No, he was one of the real lions of the civil rights movement. And he believed in the gospel, but he believed in the kind of gospel that required you to stand when other people are sitting and to speak when other people are quiet. And I really, really respect that. Let's see. Yes, my hero, Thurgood Marshall. Another fantastic book I recommend to people. There's a book that just won the Pulitzer called Devil in the Grove by Gilbert King. And it's an amazing book that details Justice Marshall's, one of his cases that took place in Florida, where he was threatened with absolute death and destruction if he intervened in this case, and he intervened anyway. And there were several times where he literally got out of town barely. And I think it's an important narrative about Justice Marshall that we don't actually appreciate. He's a sitting U.S. Supreme Court justice. That's what we understand about him. But he was also a brilliant tactician, a brilliant strategist. He kept more cases from the U.S. Supreme Court than he took to the U.S. Supreme Court. And as a lawyer, you'll appreciate the significance of that. He always had a sense about when it was time to push the court to make a decision. And you have to be really careful about that, because if you push them before they're ready and they make the wrong decision, then you've created precedent that may block reform for a generation. And so I really respect how brilliant and strategic he was. He was obviously a great leader. He created the Legal Defense Fund to do amazing things, but he was just a brilliant tactician. And I think too few lawyers that do human rights work today think tactically. I think too few lawyers think that way. A lot of lawyers think opportunistically. And I think that's one of the challenges we have in sustaining the kinds of reforms that he ushered in the 1950s and 60s.
Just out of curiosity, when you were part of taking up the Miller versus Alabama case, was that strategic? Was it opportunistic? Did you have this in mind?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. It was purely all strategy. I mean, we had many opportunities to take cases to the court. In the years leading up to that, we chose not to. We had basically a 5-year strategy to get young offenders who we thought would make compelling narratives around the set of issues that we thought were important. No, we were very determined to find a path to the court that maximized the chance of relief, because we knew that the odds were against us. And the same was true for Justice Marshall. You know, Brown and these cases had all kinds of precedent leading up to them that said you will not win. And so you have to maximize your chance of success. That was certainly what we were trying to do in Miller and Jackson and all the juvenile cases. Yeah. Yes, my friend, actually, Marion Wright Edelman, I've had the great privilege of working with her very closely for the last several years. She was just in our office a few weeks ago. She's the founder of the Children's Defense Fund. Has done amazing work advocating for children over the last half century. It was the first African-American woman admitted to the bar in Mississippi. Still a very passionate person, doing amazing, amazing stuff. She has Freedom Summer, still very much alive. Students in this area might look it up. They have a program at Haley Farm in Tennessee, Alex Haley's old property, where they bring hundreds of students together that are interested in civil rights and civil rights activism. And she's a very, very dynamic leader. I'm fortunate to now be on the board of the Children's Defense Fund, and she's been very supportive of our work as well. Of course, Dr. King. This image of Dr. King leading a march is not an image that you see frequently. You see him at the March on Washington. You see him in different settings where he's giving speeches. We have a calendar, a civil rights, kind of a racial history calendar. And what we're trying to do with our calendar is actually give images that change this narrative, that get people to think not about the glory of the civil rights movement, not about the success, not about how transformational it is, but we want people to reflect on the pain, the anguish, the suffering, the humiliation. We have pictures of thousands of children interned in concentration camps in California in World War II who are Japanese American. We have pictures of Native children forced from their homes to attend schools where they were going to be taught that the Native way was backward and ignorant and wrong and immoral. And we have lots of pictures depicting the experience of African Americans in slavery during this terror era and during the civil rights era. And so the picture of Dr. King that I've been drawing attention to most recently is actually a picture of him being arrested in Montgomery in 1955. And the police officer has his arm pulled way behind his back, and they're pushing him down on this table, and he's in obvious pain and anguish at the hands of these police officers, and Coretta Scott King is standing next by watching him very soberly. And I think that's the image that we need to focus on when we think about Dr. King, because his life was suffering and struggle and challenge and resistance and hostility. And yes, there were moments of transcendent oratory and transcendent hopefulness, but we need to understand this other part of him. And that's why when I see images of him, that's what jumps to mind, is that image of him being arrested, of him being kind of coerced into a jail or to a cell.
Well, interestingly enough, that particular picture with Julian Bond, who was, of course, part of that work,
yes,
he says, look at Abernathy.
Yes.
Reading the newspaper as if he's reading the sports page.
Well, my favorite Ralph Abernathy story, I teach law students. We bring them to the South, and they go into poor communities, and they help us investigate the lives of our clients, many of whom are incarcerated or condemned. And I tell them, you're going to be going into communities where you're going to be talking to older people of color. And when you go into these communities, I want you to remember something really important. You think that a way of showing friendliness is to go into some place and say, my name is Bryan, your name is Robert, you call me Bryan, I'll call you Robert. And you're going to be friendly by showing that you're going to call them by their first name. I said, in the South, doing that with many people of color, it would be a real mistake. And every person of color you encounter should be Mr. or Ms. or Miss, because throughout most of our history, black people were not allowed to have those titles. In fact, I was just talking to a lawyer yesterday who did a case, Fred Gray, who did a case in Mississippi of a sergeant. And he called his client Mr. Jones, and the court said, you will not call him Mr. You will not do that. Black people were not afforded those titles. And as the civil rights movement was growing in strength, this desire to be called Mr. or Ms. or Miss by somebody white was something that people talked about. And my favorite Ralph Abernathy story is that he was giving the warm-up speech for Dr. King in Mississippi at some place, and he said, when the civil rights movement prevails, we're going to have people calling us Mr. Jones and Ms. Smith and Miss Wilson and Ms. Clark and Mr. Clark, and they're going to call us Mr. and Ms. and Ms., and everything's going to change. And then he said, and maybe after we get freedom and after we get civil rights, we won't call them Mr. We'll call them by their first names. In fact, he said, when we get civil rights and we win this struggle, it's not even going to be Mississippi anymore, it's just going to be Sippy. And I love that story because it reflects his character and his sense of humor and his craftiness, really. He was a very, very creative and engaging person. It is fascinating to see him reading the paper here, though. Another amazing person, Roy Wilkins, who was just an extraordinary organizer. He had those kind of organizing skills and strengths to kind of actually make things happen. You can't get 100,000 people together moving in an orderly way without a lot of organization and a lot of thought. And he was an amazing organizer, thought leader. Another fantastic, fantastic organizer, James Farmer, had incredible insight about the needs of the rural poor. And the reason why he talks so much about voting and education is he understood that these communities had been condemned structurally. And in some ways, James Farmer was the person whose writings and teachings help you understand what we mean when we talk about structural poverty, when we talk about structural racism, because there are structures that can actually keep communities poor for centuries, for decades. Our new project is actually trying to do something about that. We have a project where we're working in the Black Belt, these counties that go from the coast of the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi Delta. They're called Black Belt counties because during the 19th century they had very black, fertile soil. Because they had that kind of soil, big plantations grew up there, and they now have huge black populations. At the end of the Civil War, they had huge black populations. Now they're majority black counties, some of the poorest counties in America. But during the 20th century, after slavery, white landowners didn't want these black farm workers and tenant farmers and sharecroppers to take any other kind of job. They needed low wage workers. And so to accomplish that, they kept out manufacturing. And one of the challenges that we have in the South now is we have a big spate of land where there's been no manufacturing in the 20th century. They zoned it out, wouldn't let manufacturing come because they didn't want any competition for low wage workers. And so in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, when manufacturing was creating wealth in communities like Meadville, and communities in the Midwest and the valleys where you had manufacturing coming in, and even though it didn't last forever, you still had it coming in. You created a middle class, you created opportunity. The zipper manufacturing plants, the whatever. You know, all of that was developed because you had a workforce that could do it. It could have happened in the South, but white landowners said, no, stay away. And in the 1970s, when people of color finally got the vote, they said, okay, now we're going to create these opportunities. And guess what? They were 60 years behind the rest of the country. And because of that, they haven't been able to attract manufacturing even today. And that's what I mean by structural poverty. Racism created these structural barriers that have created generational poverty. James Farmer understood that in the 40s and 50s. And that's why he had such an interest in unionizing sharecroppers and tenant farmers and creating a consciousness that we can organize and create an economic resource in our togetherness. And it's a really, really important insight for how we deal with race and poverty moving forward. Another one, man, you've got all the good folks in here. Philip Randolph, again, and it's an extraordinary organizer. Understood the power and virtue of work. I mean, what I love about the rural South is that people value work. It's not just the money they get for it, but they value the identity that goes with work. Even farming, even agriculture. My people were the same way. Everybody in my family valued. They were working as domestic people. They were maids and domestic workers, but they valued work, and he understood that and preached that, even in settings where it didn't have the direct payoff. This is Reverend Abernathy again, who I've talked about. And then, yes, Whitney Young, an amazing leader who understood how these issues would play out in urban settings. And had experience in working in the urban. All these great folks. E.D. Nixon is from my town, Montgomery. Mr. Nixon, again, a fantastic organizer. The Montgomery bus boycott would not have succeeded without E.D. Nixon. He's the one who developed the resources necessary to organize transportation and get people from point A to point B. I'm going on and on. but that I've been talking about the boycott a lot here. One of my, because I think in some ways people, until you come to Montgomery, you don't really appreciate how challenging it was. Because when you get to Montgomery, you realize it's a big town. It's not a little tiny town. And when people committed themselves to boycott the buses, they were committing themselves to walking 3 miles to work at the beginning of the day, working 10, 12 hours, and then walking 3 miles back home at night. And the boycott went on for a year, and you had these older women and men, 70s and 80s, working as domestic workers, walking 3 miles to get to work, working 12 hours. And toward about, I don't know, the 8th or 9th month, the younger people started saying it's time to end the boycott. They said, who cares whether you get to the place you're going to in the back of the bus or the front of the bus? It doesn't make that much difference. It doesn't slow you down that much. It's time to give up the boycott. These older people are walking 3 miles in the morning. They're working 12 hours. They're walking 3 miles. It's too hard on them. Let's stop the boycott. And I love this story about how they were about to give up the boycott when this older woman stood up and said, don't y'all stop nothing for me. And she said, yes, I've got to get up and I've got to walk 3 miles in the morning, and yes, I work 10 and 12 hours, and yes, I've got to walk 3 miles back home at night. She said, but I'm not going to stop, and you all can stop, and if you stop, I'll keep walking all by myself. And just when she thought the church was prepared to give up, she got up there and she said, you know, I've got to keep walking because I believe I'm going to sit in the front of a bus in Montgomery. And then she said, my feet are tired, but my soul is rested. And there is something about that spirit, which you see in the lives of people like E.D. Nixon and all of those great architects of the Montgomery bus boycott. Again, my hero, John Lewis, who's still doing amazing work. I had the great privilege of working with him on some recent projects. We actually just wrote something together about the presumption of guilt. He's been very courageous in talking about the manifestations of these issues in contemporary society, the challenges that young men of color have in America today are still very, very prevalent. I'll talk about this later, but you know, the Bureau of Justice now projects that 1 in 3 young black men is expected to go to jail and prison. Every 1 in 3 black male babies born is expected to go to jail or prison in the United States in the 21st century. That wasn't true in the 20th century. Wasn't true in the 19th century. This is the first century where the rate of expectation is as high as it is now. If you're a high school dropout, the rate is 70% expected to go to jail or prison. And a lot of that has to deal with the economic and social conditions that too many of these communities create, but a lot of it has to do with the presumption of guilt that we assign to people of color, particularly boys of color. And whether they're Latino or black or whatever, it's a burden. And John Lewis appreciates that, and he recognizes that. And we've been trying to talk about that to get people to appreciate the challenge it creates today. When you have these stop and frisk policies, I was in a court actually not too long ago, and was sitting in it was a court I'd never been into. I was going to represent somebody. I was a young kid, and I was sitting in the court. It was an empty court. When I was sitting at the lawyer's table, defense, I had my suit on, and I was just waiting for hearing to start. And then the judge walked out, and the prosecutor walked out. And when the judge looked at me sitting there, he said, hey, don't you come in here without your lawyer. You go back out there in the hallway and wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendants in the courtroom. And I stood up and I smiled. And I said, oh, Your Honor, I'm sorry. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. The judge started laughing. The prosecutor started laughing. And I made myself laugh, too, although I didn't think it was funny. But I didn't want to create a dynamic where my client was going to be disadvantaged before the hearing started. Then my client came in, a young white kid, and we did the hearing. But after the hearing, I was sitting in my car thinking about the weight that accumulates after a lifetime of being presumed guilty, dangerous, other, not who you are. And giving voice to that, I think, is one of the real challenges of our current set of issues in civil rights, and I appreciate Representative Lewis is taking that on. That's a fantastic photograph of James Meredith and who integrated Mississippi. There's a statue there. I like Mr. Meredith because he's also dealing with what I'm dealing with, which is this sort of simplification of the civil rights movement. I'm very troubled by the way we are celebrating some of these 50th anniversary things. I don't like the way we've simplified it. We've made it sort of celebratory without talking about the challenges. And so he doesn't usually go back to the ceremonies at Ole Miss. He doesn't, because he doesn't think the kind of change that they are claiming has actually taken place. And I think we've got huge challenges in this country, even in the next year, as we think through this stuff. Because I get frustrated. You hear some people talk about the 50th anniversary, and it's almost as if, the civil rights movement was this 3-day experience where first day Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat. The next day Dr. King led a march on Washington, and the third day Congress signed all these laws. And isn't it wonderful that in 3 days we created a different America? And if you think about it like that, you're going to get frustrated that people are still talking about race and bias and exclusion. And I don't like the way we have related the narrative. James Meredith was lucky to survive his first weeks and days at Ole Miss. And in fact, most of those students who pioneered integration were tortured, they were threatened, they were expelled. Terrence Roberts, who is one of the original Little Rock Nine, was just with us. Most people don't realize that after those black students integrated Central High School, the governor shut down public schools for a year. Nobody went to school in Arkansas, in Little Rock, for a full year to resist integration. That's how deeply resistant people were. And so the celebrations tend not to emphasize that, and I think that's a mistake. I think that's a problem.
Interestingly enough, I interviewed Terrence.
Oh, is that right?
But nobody would have ever understood that, what you just said. And even more so, he moved to California.
Yes, he did, yeah.
To get an education.
That's right.
Never to come back.
That's right.
I mean, for schooling.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And I think there's an important part to his experience that we have to think about. What does it mean, Yeah. But I really appreciate Mr. Meredith's willingness to be vocal about that. There's a statue of him on campus. Of course, it was just recently vandalized. And really denigrated in a way that has created some issues, and we still have a lot of work to do in some of these places. Extraordinary people, you've got all of them. These are the plaintiffs and Brown. And we use a lot of these images of people of color going into previously all-white settings. It's funny because my school, I was really small, it was elementary school. The black school didn't close until I was in the 3rd grade. And then the year I was in the 2nd grade, it was voluntary. You could go to the public school or you could go to the black school if you were a kid of color. And because my parents worked and there was no transportation to the black school, they said, no, we want you to go to the public school. And of course that meant I was the only black kid in this all-white class, or these all-white classes. And when my brother was a year older than me, and when my brother first went there, my mom was so nervous about what that was going to be like. She used to take me to the playground at the time that they would have recess. I was like 5. And she would take me there, and then she would help me climb over the fence during recess. And my brother and another kid whose name was Jose Santiago, who was the only other kid of color, because we had migrant farm workers in the community. He was like several years older than the other kids. He was much bigger than everybody. My brother and Jose would run to this spot. I would climb over the fence, and I would help them fight all the other kids during recess. I thought it was fun because Jose was so big, nothing bad ever happened to you. But it said something really interesting to me about the way people coped with the early difficult years of integration. And it's a weird thing, but it's an amazing thing when you think about it. And I think that's not been adequately explored or addressed, and that's why I think these kinds of images are so important. My heroine, the true hero of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, who I had the great privilege of spending a lot of time with, amazing, amazing person. We went to Tallahassee. This would have been in the 90s, I think, and she was getting an honorary award. And there was a panel, and I was speaking on the panel, but I used to escort her from place to place, and I never will forget this, a full gymnasium full of graduates and students, and everybody was sitting down. They'd all processed in, everybody was sitting down, And the band had been instructed to play as the first song in the graduation program, We Shall Overcome. And when they started playing it, Ms. Parks looked left and right because nobody stood. She looked left and right. I was a few rows back, and then she turned to me and she said, you know, she just nodded her head, and then she stood up because we believe that you're supposed to stand because you're supposed to do something when you say, we shall overcome. And even then, she influenced that whole auditorium. She stood up first, and then a few other people stood up, and then the whole room stood up. And it was just sort of a testament to her capacity to move people, which I don't think a lot of people appreciated. She was an amazing, amazing person.
Did she along the way, I mean, her name of being so affiliated, did she feel like a burden, if you will, being Rosa Parks? Because here she was a secretary that kind of, I want to say, was part of a test case.
Yeah. I don't think she felt any more burdened than other people who were active in the civil rights movement. I mean, she wanted to be a force. I was at this banquet yesterday honoring Fred Gray, who was the lawyer who represented Ms. Parks. And when Mr. Gray was talking yesterday, he said, when I was on those buses as a college student, it just made me so ashamed to be so compliant. And he said, I decided I'm going to go to law school and I'm going to get a law degree. I'm going to attack segregation everywhere I see it. I think she had the same vision. She wanted to attack segregation everywhere she saw it. And so it wasn't the first time she got arrested. She got arrested many more times after that. And I think she felt that that was her calling, her challenge. And she thought it was important that people who weren't ministers, who didn't have doctorate degrees, be forceful leaders in the civil rights movement, because everybody said all the time, this is a movement for everybody, not just the preachers, not just the kind of the elites, if you will. And I think she very much recognized that. Medgar Evers, of course, a true one of the martyrs of the civil rights movement, because in so many ways he understood the power of exposing the violence behind bigotry and racism. I mean, that's the part of that legacy of terror. When you see it, you realize that this is not benign. You realize that this is not necessary. And he really was committed to exposing that. And obviously, it paid a huge price for it. Brilliant strategist, Barrett Rustin, just brilliant. I think, if he were alive today, he would have the capacity to get someone elected president or whatever that nobody thinks could be elected. He just had the kind of genius to recognize how to create narrative, how to create movement, how to create progress. And doing it while being openly gay spoke again to his courage. I mean, these folks were amazing, I mean, just unbelievably courageous. We're, appropriately celebrating, these professional athletes that are now coming out in basketball and college football, et cetera. This was 60 years ago, at a time when all people of color were despised and rejected and subordinate in many ways. And then to add on top of that, the stigma of being gay, even in settings where people of color weren't going to support you, just speaks to a man with unbelievable heart and conviction. And I've always respected that about him. So many of these amazing folks. Charles Hamilton Houston was in many ways the architect of the modern legal movement around civil rights. Houston was the dean of Howard Law School, which is where most people of color went to law school because they couldn't go to their schools and their universities. And he would tell these black law graduates at Howard, when they graduated, he would get up and he would give a speech and he would say, because you are graduating from law school, you will be one of two things. He said, you'll either be a social engineer or you'll be a parasite. And you have to choose what you're going to be. He said, but because you have knowledge, because you have skills, because you can help people, you have to commit to engineering a society where we help more people. And if you don't do that, you're going to be drawing the blood from the community of people that gave you the space that you have in this law school. And I've always valued that orientation. He was an incredibly powerful orator who motivated so many people. All of these wonderful folks at Ella Baker, the amazing Ella Baker, who has inspired a lot of folks, and she was much more tactical than people have given her credit for. And I like that people have embraced her capacity for organizing and multi-faceted advocacy. Her organization, the Ella Baker Center, was named after her in San Francisco, is now one of the premier organizations dealing with criminal justice reform, and a whole host of folks have produced some really amazing people, and I think they're quite proud of her legacy. And yes, of course, the Panthers, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, you know, and they played an important role. There's a new documentary about the Panther Party that's going to be released. I'm going to blank on the name of it. The Other Trial of the Century, I think is what it's called. Really important part of the narrative of people basically saying we've got to create a different relationship to the systemic violence and terror that we've seen. And you know, the Panthers actually organized in Lowndes County. People think it was in Oakland, California. It was actually Lowndes County, where there was first the Black Panther Party that led to a political movement. W.E.B. Du Bois, of course, is the intellectual giant who created so much of the deep understanding. One of my favorite pieces of writing about race in America is an amazing essay in his landmark book, The Souls of Black Folk, called Of the Coming of John. It's an incredible essay. It's one of the great essays in American literature. And Du Bois tells this story of a young African-American boy who was sent from his community in Georgia to a boarding school for black kids. And all the people pull their money together to send this child to school because they want him to come back and be a teacher, because there's no black school in the community. And they send him to this school, and this kid is you know, a happy-go-lucky kid, and he's playing around, and he's just having fun. He's enjoying the freedom of not being in the kind of the segregated white world. And finally, the teachers call him in and say, look, you're about to flunk out. We're going to send you back to your community, and you're going to have to explain to them that you didn't get a degree. And he's so mortified at the idea of going back and breaking the hearts of all of these people that he completely transforms himself. He becomes a very sober student. He gets his degree. And then Du Bois in the story sends him back to the community, determined to build this school. And he's so focused on equality and changing the way people think. He's obviously alienated all the white people by the way he's talking, but he also starts to alienate the black people because he's moving too fast. And he asks the white judge for permission to use the building as a school, and the judge gives him permission. He's teaching, and finally things get so stirred up that the white judge, shuts the school down. And he's at this point really dispirited. And he has a sister. His sister works for the judge, and the judge has a son whose name is also John. And he's walking home, and he sees this white John being aggressive with his sister, being suggestive, maybe inappropriately harassing her, fondling her, and he just loses it. And he picks up a tree trunk and he hits the white John in the head, and he falls on the ground, and the implication is that he's dead. And then Du Bois ends the story with John going home, saying goodbye to his mother, and then being chased by the lynch mob that finally catches him. And it's such a complex story, but such a powerful story about the challenges that people of color and communities that are majority have had in making peace with this legacy that they've created. You know, one of my great concerns is that we created a generation of people who are white, who were taught that they are better than other people because of their skin color. And they were taught that by people they love, people they trust. And then we had the civil rights movement, and we didn't help them recover from that abuse. We didn't go back and say, okay, now let's deconstruct that. Let's do some reprogramming. Let's do some re-education. We left it up to them to find their own way to the lie behind that training. And guess what? You don't find your own way that easily in a country that continues to reinforce some of these narratives. And I think Du Bois had an insight about that, that he expresses so powerfully. Of the Coming of John's one of the really great classics. Still an amazing, amazing force. He's actually now teaching, Bob Moses is now teaching at NYU. Yeah, he's teaching a course in civil rights and was the fearless, in many ways, he was the person that everybody talked about. He was doing the work in Mississippi, fearless, just would go to any place and be a witness. He said, basically, we have to show people that strength will prevail, that courage will prevail. And even when it doesn't in that moment, we have to keep making that witness. He embraced nonviolence with the kind of radicalism that even put many others in the civil rights movement to shame, and he's still an amazing force. About 15 years ago, he started a project in Mississippi called the Algebra Project, where he began teaching algebra to kids of color in very poor school systems, and had remarkable progress with these kids. They started doing very well in standardized tests, and he's been innovative throughout his career, an amazing person.
By the way, are you still teaching at NYU?
I am, yes. I teach a course called Eighth Amendment Law and Litigation, which is about basically punishment. I teach a course called Racial Justice Law, where we're actually looking at racial history. And then I do a clinic where we take, anywhere from 12 to 16 students, and they come and spend the semester with me in Alabama. And we represent people on death row. We represent children who've been sentenced to die in prison. But yeah, that's still an important part of what I do. I'm there mostly in the fall. I'm only there a couple of nights a week, but it's still an important part of what I'm trying to do. And then there he is, your friend Julian Bond, who I understand was here not that long ago, an amazing person, still doing fantastic work, incredibly eloquent, forceful narrator of what's important about the struggle for civil rights. I'm really proud to have spent some time with him.
Bryan, by the way, if we had a baseball card of you,
yes,
what would it say?
Wow. I don't really have a sense of how to characterize. I mean, I think for me, when I think about my work, when we started representing condemned people, I think that if there have been four institutions that have shaped the lives of people of color in this country, I'd say it's slavery, terrorism between Reconstruction and World War II, apartheid in the Civil Rights era, and I think the fourth would be mass incarceration. The way in which we have used jails and prisons to stigmatize, to oppress, to create hopelessness in communities of color. And so for me, that's been the great institutional challenge that I've tried to take on. And so my card would talk a lot about the work we're trying to do to reduce mass incarceration, to try to end the kind of race consciousness that has created so many unreliable outcomes. But I think mostly, it would be, I tell this story. I was in a church giving a talk. I was talking about the stuff I talk about, death penalty, massacre, all this stuff. And there was an older man in the church. This older man was in a wheelchair, and he was staring at me pretty intensely all during my presentation. And I didn't know whether he was angry or hostile. He had a very stern look, and I was actually distracted by him a good bit. And finally, after I finished, people came up. They were very nice. They were very kind. And he was still sitting in the back, and he had a little boy with him. And he nodded to this little boy, and the little boy wheeled him up to me. And I never will forget it. This man came up to me and had a very stern look on his face. And he came up to me and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I was taken aback, so I just looked at him. And he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I really didn't know what to say. And then he smiled just a little bit, and he said, "I'll tell you what you're doing." And then he said, "You're beating the drum for justice." And I never will forget it. He says, "You're beating the drum for justice." And then he said, "You keep beating that drum for justice." And it was a really amazing moment for me. And then he pulled me to him and he said, "Come here, come here, come here." He said, "You see this scar I have on my ear?" He said, "I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama in 1964 trying to register people to vote." He said, "You see the scar I have right here? I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi trying to register people to vote in 1963. He said, "You see this spot over here? That's a bruise I got in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And then he said, "People think that these are my cuts and my bruises and my scars." And he put his hands on his head. He says, "These aren't cuts, bruises, and scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." And if I ever get a card, I'd be honored that just somebody said he tried to beat the drum for justice. That's all I'm looking for. And it's all we can do. But I'm really, really privileged to be doing the work that I'm doing in the place that I do it.
Do you see that yourself? And I know this is an unfair question to ask you, but we'll history sort of see you in the lineage of these people you've just had cards at?
Well, I don't know. I think that, I think that there is a continuing struggle. We resist the idea that it's time to stop talking about these legacies. I think for me, what's important is that we push the society to do more than it's done, to be more honest. The work that I'm trying to do now around race and poverty is to just get people to realize that we've got so much to talk about, so much to do. And maybe, I don't know, I think I wouldn't have imagined that I would be able to kind of see some of the things I've seen. Like I said, I grew up in a community where black children, I never met a lawyer until I got to law school. I had no expectation of being able to practice, to go to the Supreme Court, to do any of these things. And I don't think for me it's so much as carrying on something as doing the things that need to be done. I don't know what will be essential in 20 years or 30 years, but I know that there will be tension and there will be injustice. And I know that somebody will have to stand up and fight that injustice. And I think to a certain extent, all of these people are part of that bigger community. And to just be even referenced, to even be a footnote for me would be an extraordinary honor.
Speaking of talking, you were one of the 2012 TED Talk folks.
Yes.
What was that experience like?
Again, it's embarrassing. I should stop revealing so much of the stuff that I reveal. I had never heard of a TED Talk. I was given a talk somewhere in New York, and somebody came, Chris Anderson, so, I do TED, I'd like you to come and give a TED Talk. And I said, okay, just let me know the schedule. And the TED Talk was scheduled the same month that I had 2 U.S. Supreme Court arguments. The Miller and Jackson arguments were about 2 or 3 weeks after TED. And so when they called me and said it's going to be March of whatever it was, I said, I'm sorry, I've got 2 Supreme Court arguments that month. I can't come and give a TED Talk. And I said, no. And I was in a meeting with my staff. I said, TED or somebody called me and asked me to do a TED Talk. I told them I don't have time for that. My staff went ballistic. They were like, what are you talking about? You have to call them back. You have to. And so I did, and I was really pretty astonished by the environment. It was really stimulating, amazing. I sat there for a day and listened to these extraordinary presentations. But I was really, really impressed by the environment, by the openness, and had a great experience just trying to talk a little bit about what I do. And
apparently received the strongest standing ovation ever seen at TED, and raised lots of money.
Well, the money was a complete unexpected reaction, but we were very grateful for that. It came right at the time when we were doing this work on children prosecuted as adults, and the responsiveness of that community really allowed us to move some things forward that would not have been possible without that. So that's been a really positive recent experience for me.
So you go to the court first time.
Yes.
Argue before the United States Supreme Court. I've been there, but I've never argued. I can't even imagine what you feel like day one, or that you go in there and just, can you tell us your emotion?
Well, the strangest thing for me is the first time I went to the court, it's lawyers who do appellate work, you're used to mastering the precedent. And you know what all the holdings are that are shaping the legal issues, and you try to manipulate these holdings to get the court to go your way. And knowing the precedent is really the secret to good advocacy. The problem with the U.S. Supreme Court is that they create the precedent, right? And typically when you're in front of them, it's because there's some gap. And so it's an argument unlike any other argument, in that you can't just say this court is required to, under so-and-so case and so-and-so case. They're not required to do anything. I mean, you can talk like that, and that's what changes it, really. You're not able to just say, you must do this, or some court will reverse you. That was the kind of the really first thing that I found disorienting. And then, of course, because it's 8 very active justices, it's really challenging to prepare. You don't actually get to say anything. I think the first time I was there, I said, may it please the court, my name is Bryan. And before I finished my name, they had asked me a question, and then you're off. And so it's much more improvisational. It's jazz, it's not classical. It's very definitely trying to move the court. And then, of course, there are the divisions in the court, and you've got to be mindful of those divisions. You know that there are certain justices in my field that you have to have, and so you have to be particularly attentive to those. So it's a lot to hold in your head, while you're trying to present. And then there's, of course, this gallery of critics who are going to dissect everything you do, which is not that's not the norm either. But I have to say, it's been pretty exciting to present in that court and to see the possibility of real reform. I mean, we've won some cases that have really changed the landscape, and that's really, really energizing.
Who's your favorite justice when it comes to your view?
Well, of course, I have to say Justice Kennedy, because he is the deciding vote on all of the issues that I respect a lot of the justices. I had a great privilege of spending some time with Justice Stevens before he retired, and I appreciate the way he evolved on the court and the voice that he gave to a lot of the important issues. I think he played a really important role. It was a role that was played by Justice Brennan and Justice Marshall before him. I'd like to see someone on the court evolve into that role, because I think it's important for someone to give voice, to kind of speak truth to power, sometimes as the majority, sometimes as the dissent. But, we've got to have somebody in this country that says, we are moving in the wrong direction if we're moving in the wrong direction. We're not being fair if we're not being fair. We're being abusive if we're being abusive. You look at cases like Korematsu, the Japanese internment case, where we just were horrific. It's just a horrible, horrible decision. How you can just round up innocent people and put them in concentration camps because of their ethnicity, because you're afraid or you're angry. And the very powerful dissent, where the court, where a couple of members said, this is immoral, this is wrong. It's a really important marker. Everybody in the court now wishes that had been their ruling. And I think we have to have people in the court with that kind of moral clarity and that kind of moral vision. And those are always going to be my favorite judges.
Well, let me tell you, for the crowd here, one of those justices was a guy named Robert H. Jackson, who was a dissent in Korematsu. And we had Fred Korematsu at the Jackson Center about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And his daughter was there just recently. I know that time's is cutting me off here, but this is amazing. You realize this was just going to be a private interview?
Yeah, okay.
They just showed up. And great. I must tell you, I've interviewed a lot of people. This guy is brilliant. He's just absolutely brilliant, and you just had an incredible history lesson. Hopefully you're taking notes. You're amazing.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Really, I just sat there, but I'm going to throw him a bunch of baseball cards. Can you imagine if they were actual baseball cards? Do you have a favorite baseball team? First of all, I got to ask it.
Oh, wow. I have players that I like, and when they move, I sort of go with them. So I can't really say I have a favorite team. Where I grew up, we didn't have a professional baseball. The Philadelphia Phillies would go up north, and back in my day, there were the Washington Senators. They don't exist now. It's the Nationals. I don't really have a favorite team. When I was living in Atlanta, I would go to Braves games. I played baseball a good bit. I should say the Braves, because I had a little association with them for a while. That's probably my best answer.
I know you want to have a little bit of time about Bryan. I
Yes.
can't thank you enough. This is unbelievable. By the way, I must ask, how's Fred Gray doing?
He's doing great. He is about to celebrate his 60th year of law practice. Fred Gray is, of course, the lawyer who represented Rosa Parks and did amazing cases, Scamillion versus Lightfoot, Levy-Macon, all these amazing decisions, represented Dr. King. We honored him yesterday at a luncheon. He's 82, still going strong. He's actually fighting a big case now around the economic rights of people in Tuskegee. He's doing fantastic.
What's a question I should have asked you that I haven't?
Oh, wow. I can't think of any. I think a question I don't get asked a lot is what it sort of takes to create the kind of institutions, the kind of movements that are necessary for sustaining this work. And I really think it just takes people who are willing to offer whatever they have. I tell my students this all the time. I said, to make change, you've got to be smart, you've got to be tactical, you've got to be strategic, you've got to be informed, you've got to know a lot of stuff. I want them to know lots of things. But I actually think justice is fueled by people who have ideas in their mind, yes, but who are motivated by conviction in their heart. And that's what it takes. And you don't have to have a college degree or PhD or any kind of education. You don't have to have knowledge or experience. You don't have to be a certain race, a certain gender, a certain height, a certain age. You just have to have some conviction that it's time to do something to confront inequality. And that's my challenge, is to find those people, to engage them in our work or in somebody else's work, and urge them to do the things that need to be done.
You're one motivated guy by conviction, and for that, Bryan Stevenson, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you. These are great. You're welcome.